I'm gonna go mess with my volumetric fog just a bit more. Lock my camera to my composition, hit 2, and just play around some of the colors here. So maybe I want my volumetric albedo to be more orange. To match my light. So that color will be on the screen. Also, I can mess with my directional and scattering color. Maybe punch that up towards more orange. This is the value of my directional and scattering color. Bump up my skylight just a bit, maybe 0.25. Go back to my fog. Again, this is where I kind of play with push and pull of the colors. You can use what you like that fits your preferences, but this is just kind of me fine-tuning things a little bit. Maybe I want a little bit more density in my fog, 0.2. And if I go back to my sky sphere, maybe adjust the zenith color a little bit. So the new zenith color will be on the screen. And maybe we want less cloud opacity. So right now we've just messed with our directional light, our skylight, and the fog. Hit save. Click on our post-process volume that we added earlier. If you can't find it, just type in here in the world outliner, post, and you'll be at post-process. There's two ways to do post-process. You can either take the volume that we added and extrude it to fit your entire scene, which in this case for a visual scene is a good thing to, you don't have to do, but if you had multiple post-process volumes for different locations, you want them to fit the size of the location. But for the sake of a visual scene, we can just leave it as is and go all the way to the bottom of the settings of post-process. And in the post-process volume settings, it says infinite extent unbound. With that on, it means this small box will affect the entire level. So I have my post-process selected, hit G for game mode, hit 2 to get to my composition angle. And we can play with a lot of things in here. I could spend a whole video on just this, but the basic things that I mess with really are in color grading. You have a white balance, which is a temperature based in Kelvin. The higher the Kelvin value, the warmer the scene gets. So I cranked it all the way up to the max 15,000. And it's really just punching the orange. And if that's what you like, hey, you're done. Ship it. But I think that's too much. I'll maybe bring it to around 6,500. Tint. Now, if you have a camera, like an actual camera, like you have an exposure, I think it's called an exposure tint. Basically, the higher the value, the more reds you're going to get in your scene, or this is turning to purple. And the lower the value, the more green tint you're getting. So we don't want too much tint. So I'll set that back to 0. Now let's say I want this to be maybe 0.1, even 0.2. That 0.2 is starting to look more purplish. Even maybe 0.075. Very little amount of tint. You don't want to overdo the tint. Next we have our global setting. Under miscellaneous we have our scene color tint. I usually turn that on. And this will just tint the color of the scene overall. Again, I like to, if you fully saturate it, it gets like a blood red color of the scene color tint all the way over. It's blue. So let's kind of bring it in the middle. Closer to a bright orange feel. But I don't want to lose a lot of my contrast. Actually, right here looks pretty good to me. So I'll copy the hex value of my scene color tint onto the screen. Maybe we can increase the temperature just a bit more on the white balance. So 7014. And then before I even get even further, I can go back to my skylight and play with the light color here. So I'm now increasing the value to bring up some of the blues in the background. So the new hex color of the skylight will be on the screen. Let's go back to our post-process volume. And we can change some of the global settings here. We can go to our saturation. And we can just, if we change the value of saturation, at 2, it's fully saturated. At 0, there's no saturation. It's black and white. That looks pretty cool too. So post-process is where you can have a lot of fun of what works for your scene. And if you looked at the visual scene I posted earlier, the warehouse, the different lighting schemes I got were basically messing with post-process. I didn't do much with the actual lighting colors themselves. So using the same lighting colors, I was able to manipulate it to get the noir look and the daytime feel. So let's revert that back. Maybe I want to reduce the saturation a little bit. So I usually like 0.8. Anything beyond 0.8 starts to get more black and whitish. Even let's bring that up to 0.85. Then we can play with the color of the saturation. Again, I always like to crank it all the way up. And then you can move around the color wheel, and it's almost like an Instagram filter. Let's bring the saturation back up to 0.9. But again, I don't like to overdo it. So let's bring it back to like 0.8 and 0.85. And what's a good color for my saturation? Yeah, I don't want to mess with saturation too much. I'll just set it back to default. Again, you can play with it if you want. I actually want to mess with more of the lighting settings, but I'll come back to that later. So we can go to contrast, turn that on. I turned off saturation, crank this up, and a higher contrast of the scene, no contrast of the scene. And with no contrast, the scene is pretty much gone. So we can fine tune that. I like a value 1.05. And then you can crank up the saturation of how the contrast affects the scene. and just play around with what starts to feel good for you. I think that looks pretty interesting. We'll leave it at that. And I'll copy the RGB values of the saturation or the contrast colors onto the screen here. And play with the gamma, which is kind of the overall brightness. Crank that up, bring it down. .91 works very well for me, this scene. And you can again adjust the color of the gamma. Make sure it kind of matches what you're trying to do, because like that doesn't really match, but it's an effect, right? But let's try to match it closer to what we were trying to pull off. Nice warm color. So I'll have the values of my gamma on the screen. There's also a gain. This is the more color punch, if you will, for lack of a better term. No, let's set that to, let's say, 1.6. And we can play with the gain color itself. Again, going down the color wheel, you can play around with the kind of settings you want. But I'm trying to keep it close to what we have without going overboard. So the value of the gain will be on the screen. Again, I can sit there for days tweaking with it, but I don't want to waste your time for the sake of the tutorial, but that's what gain does. Now the offset I don't usually use a lot, but it definitely can be helpful for your scene. It's kind of more of a overall darkening, brightening of the scene itself. But I think it over darkens or washes out the scene too much, so I don't use it a lot when I do visual scenes, but you can if you need it, but I'll turn it off for now. So for now I'm just using contrast, gamma, and gain. We can also just pull in a bit of saturation. Let's desaturate the scene just a bit, like 0.9, but not change the color. So just by changing those few things, our scene looks a lot different. And that's one way of doing lighting as a designer for your scene. Now you can pull and change colors as needed, but that's the basics of how I do lighting, and this is... Would I say this is perfect? Probably not, but it's just to get the point across. But if it were me, like, I would come back to my directional light, maybe bring the intensity down, lighting intensity down to 10. Or even let's go higher, let's 18. So the sun is really filling up my scene here. Maybe bring my color value down a bit, increase the saturation just a bit. Maybe increase my volumetric intensity to 1.2. Indirection intensity 3, 2 is fine. Come to my skylight. Maybe darken it just a bit more. Come to my fog. Maybe increase the density to decrease intensity 1.15. maybe play with my scattering distribution a bit. The albedo. Now, you can keep playing with different settings, but as you can see, we've drastically changed how the scene is lit by just using dynamic light, skylight, fog, and post-process. I have not used any point lights or any spotlights. You can use those as needed, but let's say we're happy with where we are. It's good to rebuild lighting one more time, even though a lot of it's dynamic. Let it rebuild our scene one more time. So go to make sure we save, build lighting only.